Welcome back to the Quantum Yoga Podcast. I'm very excited to have Dr. Marjorie Wollacott on the program. She's a neuroscientist and author of a few books that we're going to get into, and a long-term meditator. So much interesting stuff that she's been into professionally and personally, and is continuing to kind of cross and bridge those two things together, it seems, as you move further in this world. So welcome to the show, Dr. Wollacott. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Instead of myself trying to give your biography, I wonder if you could do that in just a couple short minutes and tell the listeners from your vantage, how do you describe yourself? How can you present yourself here? I was thinking about this challenge earlier before we got on the line.
Yes, I would say that I've been a neuroscientist and teaching at the University of Oregon for about 35 years and just recently retired. And saying that, when I started out as a young neuroscientist, a graduate student, and a young professor, I was clearly a materialist. I had studied, for example, various aspects of rehabilitation medicine and aging and development of the nervous system, etc. I've written about maybe 200 papers related to neuroscience and rehabilitation. I have a textbook for physical therapists and occupational therapists on improving movement control in patients. And I also have had grants from the National Institutes of Health for 35 years, from like $500,000 to $1 million per grant. So that's my materialist background. But saying that, in 1976, almost 40 years ago now, I started to meditate. And I had an experience in meditation that began to transform my whole worldview. And then what happened is I began to lead what seemed almost like a schizophrenic lifestyle of going into my laboratory and talking in a materialist neuroscience way out of one side of my brain, and then going home and meditating and interacting with other meditators and teaching yoga, dealing with totally different topics. And it felt schizophrenic. And so finally I decided I had to try to put those two together. And it started out actually with a year of sabbatical at the University of Rochester, actually looking at Asian studies from an academic perspective and studying philosophies of Asia, and then coming back to the University of Oregon and getting a master's degree on top of my PhD, but the master's degree was in Asian studies. And that was the start of my book, Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of the Scientific Mind, which then came out just 2 years ago.
Which is going to be the subject of much of our conversation today. So I encourage readers to definitely get a hold of that. I've been going through it. It's amazing. And what a synthesis that you've put together of in deep ways. You know, there's a lot of, okay, let's look at meditation with an fMRI machine. And, that's interesting. This area is getting bigger. This area is getting smaller. Without asking questions, well, where did this lineage come from? And can we drill down a little bit more into what they were thinking about the effects on the body, what they were thinking about how consciousness is interfacing with our body? And so I really appreciate that you did that. And perhaps we can start there, because it seemed like your preface to getting this master's was a personal experience.
Yes, it was. So maybe we'll start with that personal experience. So it happened when my sister, who was already a meditator, had invited me to come to a meditation ashram that was in the Catskill Mountains of New York. And she said, I know you're a neuroscientist, but I want to share this with you. And she said, I'll treat you to this meditation intensive workshop on the weekend. Now, I was a neuroscientist, a materialist. I was skeptical, but I was also curious. And I was wondering, what might happen. So I came to the workshop, and I remember on that first morning of the workshop, they said that this Swami, it was Swami Muktananda, was going to be coming around and initiating every person there. And they said that the initiation was going to be happening through his touch, and it was going to be a spiritual awakening. Now, the scientist in me was clearly skeptical, but I also realized I was already there for the weekend, and why not put my skepticism aside for those 2 days and just be curious about what might happen? So when he was walking around the room, he came to me, and I actually felt his physical touch of his thumb and fingers right between my eyebrows, on the bridge of my nose. And when he did this, I want to say that my eyes were closed, but my senses were otherwise thoroughly engaged. So when I felt something that seemed like a tiny current of electricity going from his hands down into my body, I had the sense of utter certainty about the event. And it's not that I knew exactly what was happening. To this day, I don't know. But it seemed as if this tiny lightning bolt leapt from his fingers to the point between my eyes, went down to the center of my chest. And I could feel the exact point where it stopped. It was my heart, not the physical heart, but more like a heart than my physical heart had ever felt. And this energy began radiating out from my heart through my whole being and beyond. And it felt like pure nectar, like pure love flowing through me. And the words that came to mind had nothing to do with scientific analysis. The words were, I'm home, I'm home. My heart is my home. And what was most astonishing to me actually was what happened after I went back to my teaching position in Virginia at the time. And that was that starting the very next morning, my life habits turned around 180 degrees. I woke up at 5 a.m. in the morning. I got up and started to meditate. And I've been doing that day after day after day. And in fact, it's never ceased. And I think I did that knowing that just beneath the surface of my awareness simmered this quiet ecstasy. And I knew I tapped it once, and therefore it was there waiting for me if I were to simply go inside, turn my awareness within. So that was really the start of this whole new part of my journey. And then I'm saying to myself, wait a minute, I was a materialist neuroscientist, believing that consciousness is purely the product of neurons in my brain. But now I've had an experience that tells me that consciousness seems energetic. I began to feel new energy centers in my body, like in my heart in that moment, and later in meditation between my eyes or the crown of my head. And I'm saying, what is this? And how do I put these two experiences and these two worldviews together?
Wow. Well, it sounds like you received what's called Shakti Pot, and that you had an experience or in some form of Kundalini. And so I'm sure then you explored these terms, and what can you tell us about them?
I think that this is something that many people doing research on meditation ignore, and to me, it's the most essential part of meditation. So when you look at most of the studies that are actually published in the literature, they simply say if you quiet your mind, focus it on your breath, your attention becomes stronger. And with stronger attention, your mental abilities become stronger and your brain can change. But I think that there's something more than that. And I think that with this energy awakening, which as you say is called Shakti Pot in Eastern traditions, and it's given other names in other traditions because it's a universal phenomenon, what literally happens is that an energy within you that has been dormant before literally is awakened. And it can happen spontaneously sometimes for people in dreams, but very often it happens through a spiritual master literally initiating you into that experience. And that's what happened to me. And then you spontaneously begin to feel energy centers in your body, which have been described, as you know, in the Eastern traditions for thousands of years. These various energy centers along the axis of the spinal column that interpenetrate the spinal column. And so I think that's what I began to experience without knowing anything about those Eastern traditions. I first felt the heart center, energy sort of tingling there, love radiating from that place. The same thing, vibration between my eyes and the crown of my head. And this is what reminds me that it's not just that we're hearing this from some other place and saying, oh, yes, now I feel it. These are happening to many people for the very first time before they've ever heard of Kundalini or energy centers. But it's very powerful, and it begins to open your awareness and move you in new directions you wouldn't have moved before.
In this is your sort of perspective and entry into studying this experience is, like you said, it's very different than how contemporary research is studying this. The entry almost like, what is this mysterious phenomenon that's occurring, and or how does meditation affect stress, right? It's sort of like it's the stress approach to meditation, and so people are then given a prescription of meditation to deal with their chronic stress or their overwhelm or what have you, and it's like, well, that's great because that will help. Mm-hmm. And it's just scratching the surface of possibility, and that this world of meditation is so vast, right? You've just opened a door into the multiverse of infinite potential, right? There's so much going on in there.
Yeah.
And so I wonder then, as you started to apply a neuroscience perspective, a physiological perspective that is that explanation for this energy, let's go there. How about with this energy, these energy centers, was there a correlation, or did you find a source of these conduits? And is this energy electromagnetic in nature?
Yeah.
Is this...
Let me just start with saying that when I tried to begin to put these two worlds views together in my laboratory, I did start doing this research on meditation. And I started where most neuroscientists would start, which is simply saying, okay, let me bring some meditators into my laboratory. And I also brought some people that practice Tai Chi into my laboratory. I did this with a student, Teresa Hawks. And I also brought in aerobic walkers, because neuroscientists know that the more blood you bring to the brain through aerobic activity, the better your brain will function and the more attentional abilities you might have in focus and things like that. So I said, I'm going to compare those three groups to simply sedentary adults that don't do any of those things. And we put EEG caps on their heads. And in fact, I have a picture of myself with 256 electrodes on my head as I was one of the meditators in the study. And what we did is we had people actually do a computer game. And in this computer game, they were asked to look at the computer's screen, and there was a red dot that would be going back and forth in different trials on the left or the right of the screen. And they simply had to press a mouse button on their pad as quickly as possible when that red light came on. So we were then measuring in that EEG cap what we call an event-related potential. When they see the red light, that registers in their head, and we can see how large that event-related potential is, because that is going to tell us how much attention they're actually giving to that red light. And we then are trying to find out whether the meditators give more attention to that red light than the other groups, for example. And so what's interesting is that this is a complex task, because the rules for pressing the mouse button changed every 2 trials. 2 trials, they had to press the mouse button on the same side of the screen. Next 2 trials, they had to remember 2 trials have gone by and press the mouse button on the opposite side of the screen. And this red dot is going randomly back and forth. So you really have to focus on the task. What we found was those event-related potentials in the meditators and the Tai Chi practitioners were about twice as large as those of the sedentary adults, and the aerobic walkers were about halfway in between. So it says, yes, aerobics helps our mental abilities, and meditation and Tai Chi, which are really focusing in on this intense attentional training, do much more than that. Now, that was interesting, but I wanted to know what the source of those changes were. So we use something called independent component analysis, which actually tells you what components of the brain are contributing to that EEG event-related potential. And what we found is that there were a couple of areas that were important, part of the frontal area and also the anterior cingulate cortex. And that area of the brain was one of the main areas contributing to these differences in the meditators and those that practice Tai Chi. And you might say, well, who cares? What is the anterior cingulate cortex? But this is the reason it's very important. The anterior cingulate cortex, when children are about 4 to 5 years of age, is highly correlated with their conflict resolution abilities. Their abilities to suppress some particular desire or habit and do something that might be more beneficial for them. And the size of the anterior cingulate cortex is highly correlated with their success in later life, which includes things like the amount of money they make, their sociability, their level of criminality, their health. So it's simply this particular part of the brain, it's like right about here, anterior cingulate cortex, and most importantly, it is modifiable in size through meditation. So here's the key, it's like, wow, we are literally finding that this part of the brain is critical in success in life, and it's also enlarged through things like meditation.
So you're measuring EEG in this of the ACC, and when you're looking at the ACC, are you seeing? So I do some neuromeditation, kind of neurofeedback related assisted meditation, and so for this type of meditation, a focused meditation, I usually see either like a beta 1 or a gamma of like a high attentional concentration. Was that also your finding, or were you seeing something else?
Well, in fact, so in this particular study, we weren't having them meditate. We were simply having them focus. But we have done other studies, and in which case we have often seen theta activity, for example, and certain some alpha activity. But what I want to mention is that there was one study recently done in Germany where they actually looked at different types of meditation, and they did then the EEG waveform analysis that you're talking about to see what they found. And I thought what was interesting here is that though other people, including Richie Davidson and Anton Lutz, have shown that gamma frequencies are very typical of Buddhist monks who practice compassion meditation, for example, and other people show a lot of increase in beta activity. What this particular group showed is that it depended on the type of meditation you were doing. And if you did a form of meditation that they called basically simple emptiness, you were simply trying to quiet your mind as much as possible, they found that then all of the frequencies went down toward very, very low levels. And I thought that was fascinating to me, because in people who have near-death experiences and have these amazing experiences of expanded consciousness, where they leave their body and move into an expanded awareness, their heart has stopped and their EEGs are pretty much flatlined. So it was almost as if this one group from Germany was showing that, in fact, in some forms of meditation, literally all the waveforms are actually moving down, and that may be one critical factor in addition to movement toward theta or movement toward gamma. So that's another interesting clue, I think, to what's happening.
Yeah. Well, getting back to your experience of feeling this energy in your heart, I had a very similar experience, but it wasn't through Shakti Pot, and it was extremely visceral. And it all started in this sort of metaphorical heart center, not off to the left. It was something different.
Yeah.
And it was so motivating to go back to practice meditation. And I think this is the key thing that is a struggle for people. Many people entering meditation are doing it because they're told it's good for them, and they're awaiting a reward, which takes a long time sometimes, right? You're like,
yeah.
What am I doing here? I'm sitting here all this time. And so in a lot of what I've been trying to do is, how do I shorten the time scale for people so they have an experience that they can bookmark and continually come back to? And I know you teach meditation, and can you comment on this?
I certainly can. I mean, one thing I highly suggest is finding a master of meditation that can literally awaken that energy. Because as you say, I mean, it certainly can happen spontaneously. And I've heard it happen for a number of people in that way. And if it hasn't happened for someone spontaneously, they might go to a tradition that is like a Shakti Pot tradition. My own tradition, again, was Swami Muktananda. Guru Mai Chidvilasananda is the current head of the lineage. And there are meditation intensives for awakening that meditation energy. What happened to me is sort of like what happened to you with your spontaneous awakening. In that first meditation, it was so dramatic for me, and my heart was suddenly in a new place it had never experienced before, that felt like home, that I wanted desperately to get back there again. And so that gave me the motivation to get up every morning and meditate. And I should say, some people think that was a mental motivation. It's not at all. It's like literally my heart was now running after that experience. And it came directly from this intense yearning to have that again, from what I would call the essential heart of my being, rather than my mind saying, oh yes, this would be good for me. So I think that's what's helped me keep on going month after month, year after year. And like you, I can say it's not that every morning I went into a beautiful experience like that Shakti Pot experience. I went back to my normal daily activity, and often my mind would be filled with thoughts. And in fact, in my book, I talk about that. I said, I get back to my home now, and I am now practicing meditation on my own. And I try to approach it a little bit like a scientist would. And I say, let me watch my mind as I'm trying to quiet it down. Let me watch it while I'm focusing on my breath or focusing on a mantra. And the first thing that happened to me is I saw tons of thoughts going through my mind, like probably most people do. But at least I could begin watching the thoughts going through my mind and say, wow, where did these come from? And then I began to notice that when I would focus on my breath or repeat a mantra, in our case, it was like Om Namah Shivaya in this tradition, or Soham, the sound of the breath. I found that what happened is that my thoughts began to congeal on this one phrase, and so the thoughts began to go down. So therefore, the mind became just a little bit quieter. So I could begin to see now what was happening with my mind and that ability to focus in that one area, which then would begin to affect the rest of my day. And I think that's the other thing I would say to perhaps beginning meditators is that look at the effect of that 20 minutes, half hour, 45 minutes, hour of meditation on the rest of your day to say, is it really working? Because I began to see that when I was in my department meetings and we were having intense arguments about one thing or another, I could stay calm. And I could begin to see things more from this witness perspective and see all the different perspectives and say, which one is really the best one, instead of being so only focused on my own. So I think those are some of the things maybe to remind people about as well.
When you're saying all this, I'm hearing multiple types of meditation training, in a sense, where there's an element of focus.
Yes.
There's an element of unity consciousness.
Yes.
There's an element of mindfulness.
Yes.
There's even an element of inadvertent loving kindness in a way, because there's an emotional component. And this, I think, is part of what's frustrating for new meditators, is the sheer variety and diversity of meditation, and where do I start, and all of this kind of thing. And so it's really cool to hear you talk about mindfulness as a way of understanding all of this after you kind of exit, because if you're in complete immersion, that objectification doesn't occur, right? Because you are the all, you're the everything. And so that's just beautiful how you put it. One other point about this or question about the Kundalini sort of experience is, typically what you hear, or I hear, is this awakening at the root, right? At this bottom center that's now going up the spine, charging and opening each one of these centers as it gets to the top. Yet that's not how yours occurred. It occurred from what would be the third eye going downwards to the heart center. And but you mentioned in an interview somebody else that was actually in the same workshop or the same retreat that had it slightly differently occur. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yes, and I'll tell you that the interesting thing for me, partly about that experience, is it was another materialist neuroscientist. And he was a postdoc at this time, and he was studying developmental neurobiology, but his girlfriend said, oh, please come to this meditation workshop, a little bit like my sister had invited me. And again, very skeptical, and he was, but he came. And he said what happened to him is, in the first meditation session of the workshop, in fact, the first day, he really didn't notice anything happening in that moment. But then when he went back to his room that night, before bed, he began to notice this energy beginning to build inside of him. And he said he didn't know really what it was. He didn't even know its source, but he knew it felt very significant to feel this energy beginning to move inside of him. And then he went to bed at night, and in the middle of the night, he wakes up with this feeling of this energy, like basically a jolt of energy shooting up his spinal cord from the base of his spine to the top of the head, and then it shoots out the top of the head, and he experiences this incredible flash of the most beautiful light he has ever seen. And he says he's still in bed. And so he opens his eyes at this moment, and he sees that his awareness has left his body. He is now on the top of the room looking down on his body in this incredible state of what he feels like is like a non-dual awareness of totally filled with love. So that was his first experience. And then later on, in the next day of this intensive workshop, he learns that that was a classical experience of Shakti Pot, or this energy awakening. And he then goes back, like me, to his neuroscience life and continues to meditate. And he says at one point, he begins to feel that light in subsequent meditations getting to fill more and more of his body, till at one point, he feels it's entirely filling his whole being. And he becomes aware of this experience of absolute unity awareness with everything. He says he felt like he was entering the heart of God. And he said, yet at the same time, he felt more like himself than he had ever felt before. And that reminds me of that feeling of being home that we all seem to have when that awakening takes place.
Is it your understanding that this energy is electrical in nature, it's outside of that electromagnetic spectrum, or it's maybe that and others, and that this network that it's traveling, these conduits it's traveling on, are physical in nature, or it's a different system altogether?
That's an interesting question. And I think that one of my frustrations as I look at some of the literature that from India that's been translated into English, for example, is people make it sound like this energy is literally moving through different centers of the spinal cord, like physical nervous system centers. I think of it more as that these are subtle energy centers that are interpenetrating those parts of our body. And that we have the physical body, and then we have a subtle energetic body. And I believe that this is happening in that subtle energetic body. It interpenetrates, then it has an effect on the physical body. But it's not like it's sitting in one particular ganglion of the nervous system or one part of the spinal cord of the nervous system or something like that. I think that no one knows yet. And I wish that we would turn more attention in terms of our neuroscience and our psychology, parapsychology research to exactly how these two systems interact, the subtle nervous system and this physical nervous system, because I think at this moment, we do not understand that. I'm giving you right now an example of like Reiki practitioners, energy healing practitioners. They feel that when they actually put their hands over particular energy centers of the body, those chakras, that they are changing different aspects of the body physiologically underneath that are associated with those energy centers or chakras. But I don't think we have enough research in laboratories to really say much about that. And I would love to know more about it.
Are you familiar with Stuart Hameroff's theory on microtubules and they're sort of catching qubits of information of consciousness? So do you have thoughts on this?
I do, and I think that, Stuart Hameroff has one particular point of view. I know that Sir John Eccles, who was a Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist before Stuart Hameroff, had another point of view. And Henry Stapp, who was a quantum physicist who was retired from UC Berkeley, a very well-known quantum physicist, has a slightly different point of view, but they are all talking about this idea that quantum physics can really explain what might be happening with consciousness actually then interpenetrating our nervous system and having an effect on our nervous system. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Henry Stapp's because I know a little bit more about that, but they're somewhat similar. Stuart Hameroff talks about this happening in the microtubules. Henry Stapp talks about it happening at the synaptic junction between neurons, where when an action potential goes down to the end of a neuron, to the synapse, what happens is it releases neurotransmitter into the interstitial space between the two neurons, and calcium ions go inside the membrane to actually then change what is going on. In fact, I take it back. What really is happening is that the electrical activity goes to the end. That opens up the calcium ion channels. They come in and they release synaptic transmitter substance into the interstitial space. Now, the point is that we are now dealing down at a almost quantum level with calcium ions. So this is a place in the nervous system that is at such a micro level that you can actually have quantum effects on the body. And I think that's the same with Stuart Hameroff and his microtubules. They're down at a very, very tiny level. And so what Henry Stapp is saying is that when a human being makes an intention to do something, for example, it could be simply an intention to move your arm, that what you are doing at a quantum level is your consciousness is sending this information down through your nervous system, through these neural synapses, and its strong intention is allowing then the synapses to actually open in a stronger way than they might otherwise through quantum effects. Now, in my book, Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind, I describe this in a lot more detail, but he has a beautiful way of actually looking at this where, as we know in quantum mechanics, the observer is absolutely critical to the outcome of an experiment. And here he's saying that we are the observer, meaning our conscious awareness is the observer of our body in a certain sense, and therefore it has a strong influence on exactly what will happen in our body.
This is probably a good place to shift into talking about your distinction between bottom-up and top-down viewpoints, and perhaps this minority evolutionary concept within neuroscience about how this whole thing works. So please lead us into that.
Sure. Yeah, so first of all, I just want to say that when I was growing up as a graduate student and as a young professor, clearly a materialist worldview that I also subscribed to was this bottom-up perspective, which simply means that our neurons in our brain are the sole producer of our conscious awareness. And as soon as you eliminate the neurons in the brain, if you deactivate them, then we go unconscious. And if you do that long enough, we die. So that is the prevailing neuroscience worldview. But more people now that are beginning to look at neuroscience and meditation or near-death experiences are beginning to say, wait a minute, there has to be something else. Consciousness has to be more than the product of the neuron activity in our brain. So they are now saying, basically, there is probably a non-local consciousness, which exists throughout the universe. And we all have access to that in varying degrees, depending on the time in our day, the individual person, whatever. And that non-local consciousness contracts down into the limited consciousness of our mind. And that gives us our local awareness that most of us experience most of our day. And that local consciousness affects the neurons in our brain. So you literally have this like contraction downward into these more concrete levels of what we might call thinking when we get down into the neurons of our brain. And they say, and my own hypothesis now is that the interaction between top down and bottom up are both valid. So in other words, our non-local consciousness, for example, in that moment where this Swami Muktananda touched me and awakened this energy, that can affect me from another person and awaken energy within me. And I also know that my own physiology can affect my mind as too. I can get very, very sick and something can happen to neurons in my brain and that will affect my consciousness. So I like this idea of top down and bottom up both being true and valid, rather than the old materialist perspective, which is it's only bottom up.
Yeah, wow, that sure makes a lot of sense, and it also then continues to fuel the argument for the benefit of meditation, in the sense that if you want to create change and transformation, that utilizing this top down, you're able to utilize more top down if you are quiet, because then you are less regulated by your own physiology. Your thinking is less a product of basically your body's conditioned responses.
You're also reminding me of just something that I think is important about that top-down view, is that this actually began to be prevalent within psychology with William James way back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. William James is considered like the father of modern psychology. He is revered. He was at Harvard University, very, very well known, and he did both regular psychology experiments and parapsychology experiments, and experimented with a number of different things related to, for example, religious experiences and transformations and things like that. Modern psychologists ignore that half of William James's work. They just say, oh no, that's not important. But the point is that he had a theory called the filter theory that he and another man, Myers, actually formulated in the late 1800s, which simply said that this non-local consciousness, this non-local awareness, to actually be helpful to us in our normal everyday lives as human beings, has to be filtered down to a certain extent, or we couldn't function. There would be way too much stimulation coming into us to be able to actually survive all the things that we need to survive through, like attacks of animals in the past and other sorts of things happening during our lives. So he says that this is natural, but you can actually begin to open up that filter when you quiet your mind down. When you get rid of that inhibitory influence that we currently have evolutionarily, you can then, through meditation, for example, or other ways of quieting your mind, actually get back to a more transparency of those filters, and now begin to actually hear the thoughts of other people. You can hear higher understandings about the universe through this non-local consciousness that some people call God, some people just call non-local consciousness, but it's like a higher, very, very useful and helpful and beneficial awareness that exists throughout the universe. And I love that sort of idea that we're simply trying to get rid of many of our filters as we meditate. And then throughout our lives, we can be more attuned to that in every situation we are in helping ourselves and helping other people around us.
Can you talk a bit about Kashmir Shaivism and your exploration into that world? It seems like, in a way, without the cultural language, it seems like the model is almost the same.
Absolutely. So, yes, so I should say that after I began studying meditation in this tradition that's called Siddha Yoga, I found out that Swami Muktananda's philosophy that he most resonated with was Kashmir Shaivism. And so I began studying that as well. And what I discovered about this, so this is a philosophy from around the 10th, 11th centuries. And Abhinavagupta is the Asian scholar who was actually very instrumental in bringing this out to the rest of India at that time. And what it's saying is that there is a non-local infinite consciousness, which in India is often called Shiva. And that consciousness basically contracted of its own freedom to become the world that we see, and to become our minds, for example. And that they say that basically that expanded consciousness then in becoming our minds is literally willfully coming down into this smaller, more contracted state where we perceive things in the ordinary universe. And the other thing I thought that was interesting is it said once it contracts down to that smaller state, it becomes now in a realm that we would call the realm of illusion, because it only sees small individual perspectives. It sees the perspective from you as what sometimes they call an anu, an individual, like an atom. And so you don't see the world perspective, you don't see the perspective of someone else, and that limits your ability to see truth or reality. And what you're doing in meditation is trying to expand your awareness back to that infinite awareness, or toward that infinite awareness at least, so that now you can see a much broader reality that takes into account the perspective and the benefit of everyone and everything in the universe. And I think that's the beauty of this philosophy and of meditation, because really what we're doing in meditation, quieting our mind, reducing those filters, and suddenly we feel connected with other individuals, with animals, with our planet, and then we have more compassion for others and animals on our planet, and we feel love as well. I mean, it's a beautiful state for ourselves, and it's beneficial for everything around us.
And that's where I wanted to go next with you, was the role of emotion in all of this. That seems to be what gives meaning to the experience. If we had no emotional language, or we had no emotional abilities, it's almost as if the experience wouldn't be as profound. Yeah. And so can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's absolutely true. And when you think about it, so in Asian philosophy, they talk about the self, this non-local consciousness, if you want to call it God, as having three characteristics. And that is Sat, Chit, and Ananda, which are being, we are, we exist, consciousness, we are aware, and bliss, which is this Ananda, which you're just talking about. It is something that is an essential characteristic of our highest nature. And so what literally happens is when we quiet the mind down and we get into this place, and with my own meditative awakening with Shakti Pot, you find this like love and joy just radiating out from your being. And I swear, I think that when I hear the word Ananda, bliss, I think of it as truly love and joy, like interpenetrating each other. You can't even separate them. They're so strong. A smile comes on your face, your heart opens, you feel like totally expansive. So I think that it's an essential nature. It's just an essential part of who we truly are. So for me, it's like, well, of course that's there, and we're just trying to uncover it by what the Asian traditions talk about is by purifying the mirror of our awareness, by getting rid of all of the distracting habits that we have, the wanting to have our senses go outward every moment of the day, and instead spending some time actually turning within to like clean that mirror, so then we can feel that love, that joy all the time. But it's absolutely essential. And of course, as you know, once you experience the love and the joy inside of you, you radiate that out to other people. They can't help but actually feel like it's almost contagious, and they begin to smile too. And then you really begin to see it like going out in wave after wave to the people around you.
And one of the things that I've been exploring and investigating through various biofeedback parameters, GDV analysis, biophoton emissions, hormonal profiles, is the massive physiological, the benefit to this emotional state, yes, which is amazing. It has this massive downstream elevation of everything. It's like gene expression in the way that we want to starts to improve. It's fascinating.
Yes, it is. And so you're reminding me that, in fact, that's one of the interesting things about meditation. It improves your immune function. I think so does Tai Chi. So right there, immune function. And then, as you say, gene expression. And we actually, in fact, discovered that things like heart rate variability is much better in people who meditate. It's like all of these facets of our physiology become better. And you're reminding me that I'm just in the process right now of working on a special issue for Frontiers in Physiology, one of the journals of physiology, where I was originally asked, would I actually create a special issue on things related to like regular physiology and rehab, my normal area of science. And I said, no. I want to do this on Tai Chi and meditation. And I want to look at the physiological effects of Tai Chi and meditation and the genetic changes related to meditation and Tai Chi. And so this issue will be coming out probably in about, 9 or 10 months. And I think it's beautiful because that's the fascinating thing. If it can change our gene expression, that is something that I think a materialist neuroscientist would really like have their ears perk up about and say, oh my goodness, well, maybe this is really now getting interesting for me and I want to study meditation even more.
Right. And it opens up a whole world of questions and study around generational emotional patterning and gene expression and how that could possibly change things that are being passed down generation to generation as an argument for, wow, what kind of legacy would you want to leave behind? How do you want the genes of your great grandchildren to be expressing? And can you affect that in this current lifetime, in this body that you're, and there seems to also be some yogic language to support that as well, in terms of almost time. If you open time scales up over generations of karmic expression, if you will, you can see this kind of being described in some of the literature. Yeah,
I think you're right. And I think that it's interesting, having been a graduate student taking genetics courses, that when I was taking genetics courses way back, say 40 years ago, it was understood that your genetics that you have when you come into this body are it, you don't really change them, and also that you don't pass them on to the next generation. That's simply impossible. Except maybe through a mutation or something like that might happen to you. But now they're actually realizing that the old Darwinian view of genetics is only a partial story, and that there's another view that was happening around Darwin's time called the Lamarckian view, which said that your experience in life can change your genes and be passed on to other generations. And people laughed Lamarck out of science. They just basically condemned him. And now they're saying, oh, we think Lamarck was actually right. Now they're finding, as you talked about, that our own experience can change our genes. And working with mice even, they find that that can be passed down to the next generation of mice.
You've done some study and exploration into psi and parapsychology, and I wonder if you can talk about that. We've had Dean Radin on before, and he introduced the concept, but tell us about your foray into this world.
So first of all, I was very intrigued by it because I was interested in how the mind can actually influence not only its own body, but other people's bodies and the environment as well. And I realized that when you look at things like energy healing, that is very interesting, but it's a very complex system to begin to work with, because if you're working with another human being, they have tons of influences on them every day. Their stress situations in their life, the world political situations, their own physical health, it goes on and on. So why not start with simpler systems? And so what I liked about John's lab at Princeton and then Dean Radin's work with him and with others was that they were going down to, can a human being actually affect, in this case, a random number generator? Or, and they showed that yes, with intention, you can affect the output of a random number generator. And he showed that meditators were better than non-meditators in influencing the output of the random number generator. So clearly that focused ability in meditators is important. But then going on from his work, other people looked, for example, at our ability to affect the growth of bacteria and other simple systems. And yes, again, you can, with intention, increase the growth of a bacterial colony. So we now see attention from one person onto another, from consciousness of one human being onto, in this case, another living being, a bacterium. But then they go even further and they say, okay, let's also look at things like influencing another human being who is in another room that's, for example, magnetically shielded from you. Can you change their brain waves? And this woman, Jean Achterberg, who was a nurse and also interested in these phenomena, did a very interesting experiment in Hawaii, where she took something like, I think, 11 or 12 energy healers in Hawaii from different traditions, and she took them to the medical center. And she asked them to do an experiment where they were in one room that was magnetically shielded, and their person that they were trying to influence now was in another room in an fMRI machine, so that you now are able to measure the person's brain activity changes. And she had them pick somebody that they were actually associated with so that they knew them, so they had a relationship with them. And they said, what we want you to do is randomly in 2-minute intervals, you're going to actually send a particular message to that person, a healing message to them. And we're going to watch what happens in their brain. And we'll be able to tell, because they're random 2-minute intervals at different times, if that's really correlated with what you're intending to send. And what they found, amazingly to me, is that there were significant changes in the brain waves of those recipients in these 11 people, pairs in effect, and that, again, the anterior cingulate cortex was one of the main areas that was showing this incoming activity in those people. So I'm going, wow, that is amazing, that now we have a very controlled trial showing that an energy healer can actually change the brain activity of somebody in an fMRI machine.
There's some debate in the sort of the, I don't even what world this would be, but the world that I live in anyway, is the people that I've been interviewing as to where might this sixth center, this Agna chakra, or the so-called third eye, if it had physical correlates, where might those be? And some people will say, oh, it's the pineal gland. And some other people will say, well, I think it's actually the ACC if I had to choose one. And I wonder if you have an opinion on that.
That's interesting. The trouble is I don't know much about the pineal gland in terms of actually how it has been changed by various meditation and other things like that. I know a lot about the ACC, and what I was shocked about with the ACC as I began to look at the literature is, so we see that change in meditation, as many, many labs do. They also show a change with hypnosis in the ACC, and also with the placebo effect. When people think they're getting a pain reliever, they're not. What part of the brain changes? One of the basic areas is the ACC. So now I'm seeing, and again with Jean Achterberg, with this transmission, that the ACC seems to be some critical aspect of this interaction between higher consciousness and our brain. Now, it could be that the pineal gland is very important too. People thought about that for many years, I think throughout the thousands of years, maybe back maybe even Plato's time or something. So I just wish people would do more work on that when they were looking at these other areas of what we might call parapsychology and energy healing.
You're the current president of the AAPS.
Oh, yes.
Right. And that's actually, I initially got word of you via Gary Schwartz, who's involved in the same organization. And I wonder if you can also talk about this a little bit.
Sure. So, yeah, that's the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences. And we have just organized that. We had our very first meeting with our board of directors last September, a year ago. And what we are wanting to do in this Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences is bring together top neuroscientists, psychologists, philosophers, engineers, etc., from around the country and the world who have had experiences that are, for example, in meditation or in other areas, and are doing research in this area, who are beginning to put forth the fact that non-local consciousness seems to be a very viable way of looking at consciousness in the world, that it's not just bottom up, as we would say, but there really is an independent level of consciousness that we can actually measure, we can actually do experiments with in the laboratory. And one of our aims is to also nurture young faculty at universities who would like to go into this area of research and help them, for example, get papers published, help them get tenure, because the concern we have is that right now in our society, and it's been this way for the past probably 100 to 200 years, when someone wants to join a university and do research in, for example, meditation even, or acupuncture or energy healing, basically they are told you will not get tenure if you do a dissertation or if you start as a young faculty member doing research in this area. We can guarantee it. And so the poor person doesn't really have a choice. And we want to open up science so that people will be curious. I think all we are asking is that the average materialist neuroscientist has a curiosity towards seeing whether consciousness might be fundamental, whether we could do experiments to see if it might be primary. And we even want to interact with scientists that may be skeptics by saying, okay, let's take a particular experimental paradigm that we would like to use, have you look at that paradigm and say, what flaws might be in that paradigm and how would you strengthen the paradigm? And then together we can say, okay, now we have a paradigm we both agree with. Now can we accept the outcome of that experiment no matter what it is? So that we get people on board from the very beginning, really talking about the credibility of the methods that we're using to do this research.
Wow. So one of the things, I mean, this is a little bit related and kind of not at the same time, is some research that I've been looking at as it regards intuition.
Yes.
And which kind of falls into the realm of CD, the CDs that you might find in yoga, or I believe it's called presentiment is another way of stating that in the psi world, and that there are real measurable effects in the body, whether that be in skin conductance or in heart rate variability, that they're tuned they're tuned in some way to receiving information, and our filters that are in place are kind of the problem for connecting to it. And so it seems like you have some thoughts on that.
Yes, I do. I mean, and I should say that on our board of directors of the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Material Science, we have Dean Radin, who has done work on that, of course, and Julia Mossbridge and Iman Sparus, who wrote a book called, Transcendent Mind, which is published by the American Psychological Association, which is amazing because that is a very hardcore academic organization that is actually opening up to this. But what I want to say about that is, yes, I mean, those are amazing experiments that show that if you are putting, for example, on a screen various emotional pictures that might make you very happy or very frightened or angry or something like that, or sad, they can measure in the laboratory physiological changes in the person's skin conductance, etc., before the picture is actually flashed up. So basically, you know in advance at some level of intuition, as you're saying, that is about to happen. And I think that that's where many people in our organization, on our board, are beginning to say, time is artificial. It's something that in this material three-dimensional world seems to be real, but when we move back up into this non-local consciousness, we actually move beyond time so that these things can actually happen. And that's one example of going beyond time.
I mean, the line of questioning and the way of looking at this stuff it really requires one to step out of their own way and look at these base presumptions that we make about how things operate in the world and how we operate in the world. What a challenge.
Yes, and I mean, there's a part of it that it could be frightening to the ego. It's like, wait a minute, I know what my world is, and I know that it's three-dimensional, and I know that we have time moving forward, and it goes, don't tell me that I can move beyond time, or that I might know future events, or be able to read someone else's mind or something like that. And yet, at the same time, if you let go of your ego view and you say, wow, this opens me up to amazing new possibilities. If I can just be open and curious, I mean, then our heart just opens up and we expand into just this very happy, expansive state.
Well, your book, Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind, people can get that on Amazon, right?
I can actually even show it to you right now, so if you can see it right there. So.
Oh, there it is. Yep.
Yes.
And fantastic. So if people want to get more info about you and to keep up on your future work and publications, what's the best way to do that?
They can go to my website, which is simply marjoriewollacott.com. And or they can go to Infinite Awareness and find my website there. Of course, they can go to also the AAPS, the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Material Sciences, since I'm now the president, and they'll hear more about me there as well.